Wow, what a crowd. Thanks, Adrian. It's a great joy for me to be here this afternoon with you to talk about this subject, which I have to say is very close to my own heart, both as a Christian and as a mother, as a parent, as I'm sure many of you are parents, grandparents. And the question we're asking ourselves today is, what can we as people of faith do to tackle the climate crisis? And Bishop Usher has already outlined many of the solutions, and I'm not going to repeat all of those, so I might skip over huge sections of my talk to get to the bit I want to talk about. Because I really want to talk about what's the role that cathedrals, these magnificent buildings, and the communities that sustain them can contribute in the face of this climate crisis. As we've heard yesterday and already this morning, our world is facing many crises, and these crises are deeply interconnected. It could seem that during the COVID pandemic and now in the face of war in Ukraine, that the climate crisis has gone on to the back burner. Indeed, Bishop Usher, you spoke about coal no longer being on the horizon, let's say, as a solution. Well, in fact, I was listening at the weekend to the coal miners in this part of the world on the Sunday Politics programme with one of the local MPs debating whether the coal mine should be reopened. Astonishing in the face of the climate emergency. We are now perilously close to that 1.5 degree threshold that government signed up to keeping us below in 2015. Scientists are now telling us that the likelihood of that threshold being breached in the next 5 years is 50%. Think about that. Those facts and figures can be overwhelming, and they can still seem quite remote to us. And it's so important to us that we pause and we take stock of what that breaching of the 1.5 degrees actually means. It means the end of life for humans on many of those atoll islands that were discussed. Already it means that people living in the Indian subcontinent are continuously experiencing unlivable conditions. Just this week, the unprecedented heat wave in India, where ground temperatures were above 60 degrees Celsius. And these freak weather events, such as the floods in South Africa just 2 weeks ago, they're happening so frequently now that they hardly even register. We don't even hear about them. They've rapidly become the new normal. Whilst this can seem a profoundly depressing message, this reality check is really important for us. As Mark said this morning, we need to feel righteous anger. We need to allow that anger to rise up in us and to feel the need to express that anger in the change that needs to come about. For we're living at a pivotal moment, and an incredibly exciting moment, I have to say. The good news is that so much can be done, and so much is already being done to decarbonise our societies. We see the rapid increase in renewable energy, the switch to electric and to other kinds of sustainable transport, a far greater awareness and programmes around circular economy, and also a deeper understanding and awareness of the kinds of integral economy concepts, such as Kate Raworth's donut economy, that have so much potential to bring the human species back within planetary limits. We're seeing rapid changes also in the world of finance and investments. The rise of ESG, of climate finance, social impact investing, divestment from fossil fuels, all examples of how the financial world is finally starting to wake up and see that there is a great need to invest in a sustainable future. Yet the real challenge today is one of running out of time. The changes that we need to see are simply not fast enough and not happening at the scale that we need to see them in order to tackle this crisis within the very, very short window that remains to stay within safe, relatively safe climate limits. That window for a relatively orderly and just transition to a low-carbon future, to a decarbonised world, is rapidly closing. We're entering an era where we are already seeing the confluence of crises compounded by climate change. Moreover, there is still significant resistance to the deep change that's required to tackle the inequality of climate change. We should, as a species, be in a race for the future survival of our planet, pulling together in the same direction, in a sense to fight an enemy that we all share in terms of rising carbon emissions. Yet it seems today that every place we turn, we feel the retrograde action of the forces that don't want us to change. The world, as we know it today, is far from united, aligned, and focused on this battle for our lives, to save this beautiful planet for our children, their children, and for all of God's creatures. If we survey our world today, one thing that is crystal clear, looking at the last 20 to 30 years, and that is that the rapid and deep change we need today will not come from the top down, or at least not come from the top down alone. Nor will it come from individualized actions from the bottom up, the changing light bulbs approach. Or it won't come from there alone. Where change needs to come from, and thankfully there are really positive signs that change is coming, is from the middle. The broad middle that has the potential to impact the top and the bottom. Transformative shifts are coming from vast networks, organizations, companies, and groups that form the connective tissue in our societies and have the ability to influence change in many directions. We're seeing this in the business world with the development of the B Corps, in the political world with the development of the city network of the C20 and the vast engagement of local councils in international climate action. We're seeing it through the development of a global campaign of global networking groups, campaigning groups, such as Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, Mothers Out Front. And we're also seeing it in the faith world, through vast networks of faithful organizing, mobilizing, such as the Faith Invest, where I work, the Laudato Si movement, which is a great network of Catholic organizations, Arosha, Green Faith, and Faith for Earth. Faith action in the climate space has never been so vibrant and alive as the faith presence at COP26 in Glasgow showed last December. All of this should give us great grounds for hope. Given this race for survival, what could the role of cathedrals be? How could we reimagine cathedrals in light of this climate injustice today? The word cathedral, as has been mentioned many times over the past 2 days, is the seat, the cathedra of the bishop, historically and in many ways still today, a seat of power and authority, a place where decisions are made. But the cathedral is much more than that. Of course, it's the physical building, often standing on ancient, sacred ground, connecting the past, the present, and the future. It's the symbol of stability. It's something that's often unchanged or apparently unchanging. Places of encounter, time out, silence, music. City hubs, safe havens, these are all words I've heard over the past 24 hours. And cathedrals as mother church. Cathedrals as the womb, as the midwife, as the ark. And Bishop Usher has outlined many of the practical things that cathedrals can do and are doing to reach net zero, in collaboration with other organisations such as Arosha, Eco-Congregations, Operation Noah, many wonderful groups that can be entered into partnership with in order to take these concrete steps to decarbonise and to become leaders in decarbonisation in our society. These are important steps in setting an example that the church is moving forward with the rest of society in playing its part in the ecological transition. I want to focus the remainder of my comments, however, on building on what Austin talked about this morning, on the deeper change that needs to happen in order also to get these practical changes off the ground. Of course, we need finance to do that, we need investment, but we also need to address the spiritual challenge that climate change presents us. And in that spiritual challenge, look at whether our cathedrals can become places of deep change and transformation, places of ecological spiritual encounter, of community eco-conversion, and safe havens of hope. Because I believe that unless we start to untap that deeper spiritual need and crisis which underpins the climate crisis, we won't unleash the energy that's needed to tackle this challenge we're facing. So, the first thing, places of eco-spiritual encounter. It's well documented that perhaps the biggest single block the world is facing today in tackling the crisis is what's called cognitive dissonance. In a sense, it's the disconnect, a disconnect which is fueled by a sense of distraction from the present and the material and the being present in your life. Distraction from the truth of the situation and from the pain that comes once you acknowledge that truth is real for many people. It feels that today's society, moreover, is almost in a conspiracy to help us to feel distracted all the time. It pays financially for people to be distracted and to continually fill the void that comes from not being fully present with consumption. Pope Francis in Laudato Si highlights this interconnectedness of consumerism and dissatisfaction with life. It's a disconnect that is so rife in our societies that people feel so disconnected from each other, distracted from each other, and from the natural world. The opposite of distraction is presence and is connection. Connection to self, connection to God, connection to nature. And many in the environmental movement speak of the need for a new ecological consciousness to emerge at a deep level in order to energize the transformation we need. And it's very interesting to note that within the environmental movement, there's such a yearning and explicit yearning for spirituality. And yet, at the same time, there's almost a sense of, well, not the Christian spirituality. They have forgotten, many have forgotten the rich sources of spirituality and the rich connectedness to nature within the Christian tradition. So cathedrals, by their very nature, ought to be those places of spiritual encounter and experience. This whole architecture of the cathedral is designed to lift the spirits to the divine. These high roofs, the stained glass windows, the stone, the art, are an invitation to encounter with a presence beyond, with the divine. Often, however, cathedrals have been designed to keep nature out, rather than to connect people with nature. They can often have the feeling of being set apart and otherworldly. They reflect a worldview, and I would say a theology, which highlights the apartness of humans to nature and to God, rather than an interweaving with the story of creation. Ecotheology, informed by science, is a calling for us to rethink the God story with the great story of the cosmos, of the unfolding universe in which we are a small but important part. And there's a great yearning to find meaning, above all, in a renewed connection to God in creation, the gift of life itself. So the challenge I would throw out to you as the custodians of many of these wonderful buildings is how cathedrals in the modern age can speak into this spiritual crisis which underpins the ecological crisis today. How can we reconnect these buildings that have been designed often to protect us from nature with nature? Because I think that in reconnecting the inside and the outside together, we can start to find ways to build an eco-spirituality within our communities. And that starts by putting the integral nature of ecology at the very heart of our theology. As Pope Francis says in Laudato Si, living our vocation to be protectors of God's creation, God's handiwork, is essential to a life of virtue, not an optional or secondary aspect of the Christian vocation. How we enable these vast spaces to evolve into the future, to become places of true ecological spiritual awakening and reconnection with nature, is a significant challenge. The second challenge I'll throw out to you is around the role of community eco-conversion. One of the major challenges we face today, as I mentioned earlier, and has been mentioned several times also by Austin, is the focus on individualism. It's either about individuals switching off light bulbs, individuals recycling, individuals switching to renewables, or mega transformations that individuals feel they have no control over. And of course, all of this is necessary. However, the bits that's often lost in the middle is the fact that beyond the individual, there's a great swathe of collective action, voluntary action, that is beyond individuals and not public action or government action. This kind of action is absolutely critical to solving the climate crisis. For it's in this space, this fulcrum of civic action, of civil society, of community, that we have the formation of the new social norms, the new economic models, the new habits and behaviours that are essential to a just transformation. Pope Francis in Laudato Si talks about ecological conversion that's also community conversion. Communities of faith are ripe for this kind of collective ecological transformation. Many faith communities have been doing this for decades. And faith communities, by definition, are anticipatory communities, communities that exist to live into a different future that sets them apart. That future, as Christians, is the kingdom of God. The big question for us is how we can embrace action in our communities which goes beyond individual change and transforms it into new social practices, new rituals, new ways of being together as communities that witness to the gospel of Jesus Christ and the love of all creation. The third area and final area I want to focus on is becoming places to safeguard hope. And this has already been touched on. As we head into this unknown future of climate change, where the impacts will be increasingly felt, sadly, regardless of what we do now, and that's not to give up hope, that is actually to say we need to limit the damage that's happening and transform and act with urgency. There's a burning need to keep hope alive. It's on this last aspect of reimagining cathedrals that I want to focus and end. Pope Francis in Laudato Si ends on this note: "Let us sing as we go. May our struggles and our concerns for this planet never take away the joy of our hope." Hope is in short supply right now when it comes to environmental movement, and in particular with the youth climate activists. All around us we can see evidence that people are giving up. They're losing hope. There's a serious risk, as Mark outlined this morning, of mental health issues that are arising from the lack of climate action, as well as all the major impacts of COVID and conflict. It's really evident that many people are suffering from burnout in the climate movement, which also stems from a deep sense of futility and hopelessness about the future. There's nothing remotely joyful about most of the climate movement events I attend at the moment. And yet, as Christian communities, I feel it's in this space that we have something really important to bring. And it's not about putting on a gloss of optimism because you don't really understand the issues or are living in a dream world, which is sometimes what people can say. But it's about a deep transformation. And that, to me, starts through having places and spaces where people can come to terms with really what's happening in our world. Places to acknowledge what humanity has done and to ritualize that, to form new rituals, to lament together what has happened. And out of that lament and that asking for mercy, to then step forward with renewed hope, because our faith compels us to hope in the face of adversity, in the power beyond death and darkness, at the very heart of faith. In many ways, if we be faithful to this, we do everything. But this is not, as I say, about just being optimistic. When I talk about hope, I'm talking about something much deeper. I'm not optimistic, if I'm honest, about the fact that humanity's left it so late, that will we make all the changes we need to make in the time that's available? Very unlikely. Given the history of denial and delay. However, I have deep hope. Hope that we can always change and start again, that we're not captive to our past, that the power of humanity can triumph over indifference and evil. That is hope is a future I choose to live through every day, through daily actions. It's a choice. It's anticipation of the kingdom. This kind of hope to me is a doing word. It's active. As Greta Thunberg said when asked how she remains hopeful, she says, hope comes when we act, and only then. And there is always something we can do to generate hope. So my third challenge is then, how can you as cathedrals, as custodians of cathedrals, find spaces to nurture active hope, being havens and sanctuaries and arks and the rest? So I started this talk by saying that the facts of the climate crisis indeed are very stark. We're facing a crisis unparalleled in human and geological history. But the hope is that we have many of the solutions to solve this crisis, even now at the very, very last minute. However, as a world and society, we are not going fast enough, and we are not all pulling in the same direction. We need to pull in the same direction to reduce emissions and ensure that the transition is a just and compassionate one. As people of faith, as faith communities, as a great network of places of worship, with all the other places of worship that stand on sacred ground right across this land and the world, we have a key role to play in transforming this situation. We can do this through practical changes to lower our emissions, and that's an important moral imperative. However, we can also do much more. We can become true hubs of ecological, spiritual transformation, of community conversion, and havens of hope for the future. In the words of Nelson Mandela, it's only impossible until it's done. Thank you.